Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Reading the documents from the recent Synod on Synodality, you may find yourself wondering who the intended audience is, because they certainly don't seem to be written to the people in the pew. The jargon is rather dense. The only possible audience could be bureaucrats. Dr. Randall Smith joins us to consider that. Randall holds the J. Michael Miller Endowed Chair of Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, and he's the author of many books. Randall, thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Nice to be with you again.
It's always a pleasure to reconnect with you. Let's dive right into this. When the documents came out, when the report came out, what were some of your thoughts as you went through them?
Well, I had actually read and had been reading, the previous document. Actually, they had the Study Group 9. For people who don't know, right, after the Synod and Synodality, people know about that undoubtedly, but then there were a series of study groups on various issues. And Study Group 9 was the one that was supposed to deal with troubling ethical conundra or issues and controversial issues, which they labeled emerging. But anyway, they had put out an original sort of prospectus report in October of 2024. And just now here, May 2026, they put out their final report, or what they listed as their final report of Study Group 9 on emerging issues, ethical issues, what they called a methodology and listening for these, that are related to these emerging issues. Now, again, when they call it a final report, I don't know whether it's actually going to be, if only it were a final report, but, because these processes seem to go on and on. But anyway, it was that final report that did cause some controversy among a number of people because of what it said. One of the things that troubled people was its kind of, its open view of homosexuality, was seemingly not only welcoming, but sort of celebrating same-sex relationships. It was appended by testimonies from two gay, self-proclaimed married men, and, two couples, so not just two men, that would be like four, but the testimonies were from one of the men of the couple. But it was also, and this is, I think, what you were referring to, it's also written in a very, very, I don't want to call it dense language, but just let's call it vague, jargon-laden sort of stuff, right, with references and just sort of a language that's just very much bureaucratic, let's just put it that way.
And what's funny is we could find a host of adjectives to describe this, and I still don't think we'd hit it on the head, because you're completely right. If you'd pardon me, I'm just going to read out the title of the report that came out of Study Group 9. Theological Criteria and Synodal Methodologies for Shared Discernment of Emerging Doctrinal, Pastoral, and Ethical Issues.
Right.
You had something to say about the title.
Right. I mean, again, I miss the days when titles were things like Rerum Novarum or Veritatis Splendor, the splendor of truth, or Grammar of Assent, City of God. Whereas this one, again, that title in and of itself tells you, again, much of what you need to know about the document. It's a bureaucrat's document with lots of referral to paradigm shifts, and paradigm actually, the word paradigm, I did a word search, shows up 22 times in 30 pages. So that's a big thing they've got there. But also another word they use a lot is pastorality. Pastorality is, I still don't quite know what it is. They've described it a number of different ways. But yeah, I mean, the slang, I'm going to call it slang because that would be street language, but it's just filled with this kind of language that if you study graduate level theology, you sometimes see, and it's supposed to mean something, but I don't really think in a lot of cases it does. you could mix up. I do a thing in the article where I say, well, we could describe it this way, and it sounds very much like something from the document, but I just made it up. I just reshuffled some of the words, and if you shuffle the words around, it doesn't really change the meaning because the words don't really mean anything.
I think that's a good criteria by which you can gauge if your title either says something or says a whole lot of very little, like it communicates very little. Now, let's talk about the fact that terms like pastorality, and like you rightly note, whether that is a word, but let's talk about the specific lean of these documents. What is trying to be conveyed here?
Well, again, many people wouldn't. There'd be no reason why they would know this, but actually, and I was just finishing off an article on this, the roots of this approach to moral theology go back all the way to the early 60s. And actually, one of the major statements is in a very short document by Bernard Lonergan called The Transition from Classicism to Historical Mindedness. And the distinction he makes there between classicism, which is deductive and unchanging and static, versus historical mindedness, which is inductive and open and begins with people as experiences. That tradition, that kind of dichotomy, right, the tradition based on that dichotomy, has really undergirded the entire project of revisionist moral theology throughout the end of the 20th century. And a lot of people thought maybe that had spent, it was kind of over and new approaches have taken root, and they have. But you still find people who are trained in that tradition who are now, bishops and in leading positions who still refer to that old stuff. Again, you would have thought, oh, but that's stuff from 60 years ago, right? I mean, or 30 years ago. But it's still rearing its head like a zombie that just won't die, And you find it here in this document where, again, it's kind of like, well, we're all very much inductive. We start with human experiences. We don't want to have, like unchanging moral principles that you apply in specific circumstances. That would be bad. Anyway, and so then this is an approach which is really... It's really an embodiment and it's an expression of revisionist moral theology as it developed in the late 20th century.
And the problem with this particular revisionist moral theology is we've had popes speak very clearly against it and prophetically predict what would happen should we try to go down this route. Share with us about what they warned us would happen and what are we seeing happening?
Well, yeah, I mean, John Paul II's encyclical on moral theology, Veritatis Splendor. I think also, actually, it's also important to read his encyclical on faith and reason, Fides et Ratio, and the use of philosophy in theology is also important in this. But particularly in Veritatis Splendor, he warned against this kind of what it's clear is bringing German idealism, particularly the historicism of Hegel, and using that as the kind of foundation for thinking about theology, particularly moral theology. Because what that ends up saying is, this is really at the heart of the problem, is there's like, well, it's not merely that, technology changes, history goes on, that everybody admits. But no, the notion is that human nature changes. So that then the consequences in terms of your moral theology, then you say, well, what was wrong, the moral principles that applied or the moral norms that applied, in 1275 when Thomas Aquinas was writing, or in 1975, no longer would necessarily apply today. And so, well, how do we then judge moral norms? And the answer is, again, comes from Bernard Lonergan. Well, we think about intentionality. We think about cultures and how they understand the world. So then we have to look at the sense, this is where the sensus fidelium becomes so important. Well, we look at the Catholics around the world and we see kind of how they're feeling about issues. And we make judgments based on that.
I'm talking with Dr. Randall Smith. He is a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. And we're talking about his recent article, that highlights the problem of the reports coming out of the Synod on Synodality. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter, talking with Dr. Randall Smith. He's a theologian, a professor of theology at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. Randall, let's continue where we left off, because one of the issues that unfortunately we're still grappling with is, I think universally we still don't have a clear grasp of what synodality means, even though the major movements and major activities of the Synod and Synodality are over.
No, I never did quite know myself what synodality was or was supposed to mean, or the upshot of it was going to be. Now, by the same token, I'm a university professor, so sitting around a table, doesn't have to be, and talking to people for long periods of time is exactly, my sort of thing. So it's not as though I'm by nature instinctively think what a stupid thing to do. I think it's a great thing to do, to get together with people and talk over things. And I also think it's a great thing to do to, try to get a sense of where people are at in their faith. Again, in the United States, we did somebody did a survey about, belief in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and found it was a little depressing. And so our bishops, to their credit, decided, well, we need to really focus on that, right? The problem would be, obviously, if you did this kind of listening, which is the term they oftentimes use, and found out that, wow, a lot of people fewer people than we thought, actually have faith in the real presence in the Eucharist, right? They don't understand transubstantiation. And the conclusion you drew from that was, well, we shouldn't teach that anymore. That would be a very bad sort of listening, it seems to me, right? A listening which kind of says, oh, man, we're not maybe doing our job right. A listening which says, well, we haven't been doing our job right, so let's just stop doing it, would be the wrong kind of listening. And it seems to me that sometimes the Synod and Synodality seem to be going in that direction. We're listening to the faithful, and we find out how little faith they have, and then we conclude, well, that's sort of how we should go, I guess.
I'm really glad you mentioned that. Okay, so there's a few things you shared that I really want to touch on. The first is one of the perceptions that's come out for especially lay people who are not involved in the listening sessions and whatnot. It felt like the listening and the discussions were going on seemingly forever, and there seemed to be no end in sight. I think that confusion alone lent to a tremendous amount of speculation and, dare I say, even a little bit of chaos.
Well, yeah, and I think the other thing people were worried about, and I think rightly, having engaged in one of these listening sessions that would happen in the United States, they said, oh, we should get theologians together, not together, but like on the phone, we did something. And you can imagine how very distant and weird that was. In any case, I think one of the concerns was, who are they listening to, right? Who's in these conversations? And it's a little like when polls happen in politics, and they're like, oh, so many people think this or that. And I always tend to think, who are those people, right? Like, I never get polled, and the only poll I, can express my opinion in is voting. So it's like, well, I don't care what the polls say. I just want to go to the ballot box and vote. So, again, it's kind of like, well, I don't know who these people are they're listening to. But so often it's like, well, we were listening. And so, for example, in this report, the testimonies are of two gay men who consider themselves married. Now, I think we can hear those testimonies. I'm not opposed to that. But I think anybody listening here could maybe mention 10 or 12 people who are gay that they know who would have a very different kind of testimony, right? Having the testimonies of two people is not exactly the gold standard of sociological research, right? And it's a very, very selective listening. And
part of the other issue is if this is the particular issue that wants to be tackled, then rather than present the testimony of two, self-identified gay married men, it would have also behooved them to make sure that the narrative was balanced enough so that we don't pretend that the end game of the study group is to push for a new anthropology.
Right. And again, these groups, and it's very common among revisionist theologians, to claim the mantle of the Second Vatican Council, particularly Gaudium et Spes, the Second Vatican Council's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. But they never mention, and in this document, they never mention what was at the heart of that document, which John Paul II always spoke of, which was Gaudium et Spes 22, where he said the mystery of the human person is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ, in the incarnation, right? And they say, oh, yeah, we're very, very Vatican Council. And the point is, no, you're just not. Nothing that you're talking about, there's no indication of any appreciation of the theology of that council at all in this document, but they keep saying, oh, this is so much, stuff that comes out of Second Vatican Council. And that's one of the things I think which is sad to me, because it makes people very wary of the council, which is like, but that's not what the council was about at all. You can't claim, the mantle of Second Vatican Council if you never quote it even once.
You've got the criticism of the people from this side of the argument, of those who oppose them, that if you oppose revisionism, you're traditionalist. What's a proper way to think about that question and its response?
Well, one thing is to simply say, you've turned tradition, which is, you mean the testimony of the fathers and doctors and magisterium of the church, right? Something we've always been proud of, something that in the Second Vatican Council, it says we have to have a fidelity to. And you've turned that into an ism, right? Like, well, there's communism, there's Stalinism, there's traditionalism. Well, that's just a rhetorical ploy, right? And then you define somebody who's traditionalist as somehow, narrow, too harsh, deductive, sterile, there's sclerotic categories. That's a term they use in the document. And the point is, well, that's just rhetorical, mudslinging. I could call progressives, silly, vague, relativistic, heretical. But, that, again, would just be rhetorical mudslinging, not a serious argument, right? And so I think in one way it's to kind of say, look, that's a category, a rhetorical sort of category which you created to make us look bad. And I just don't accept it, right? Let's have a serious discussion, not, throw mud with these categories of I'm progressive and you're traditionalist or something.
And like you mentioned, these are not just bad categories, they're simply false categories, and they don't lend to a faithful reading of the doctrines of anthropology and theology in general. And so when we're looking at the proposed quote-unquote paradigm shift in the name of pastorality, I want to be very careful as I say these words. Could one read there a potential desire to break from tradition rather than seek a faithful development of doctrine?
Yes. I was less careful in my words there, right?
And I appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're careful. That's your job. And of course, my job is just to get in trouble. But no, look, here's the issue, right? Underlying the whole thing, they won't say it's a break because, it's just a development. But of course, a paradigm shift. What's the paradigm shift? The paradigm shift is from thinking of human nature as something stable, right? Again, which you see in the Second Vatican Council, revealed to us because we are in the image of God, and so we can understand by looking at God's revelation of himself, what's the nature of the human person, right? And we begin there. Their paradigm is to start from, human nature changes throughout history, and so we need to look around at the world that exists around us now and sort of come to a conclusion about how human nature has changed now. That's why sociology has become so important and psychology has become so important for these people. right? Because that sets the terms of the debate, not divine revelation, but that. And the point is then, they say, well, see, we're just developing. And the point is, no, you've changed from thinking that revelation sets the terms of the debate. We start with revelation and then look at history and make a judgment based upon divine revelation. You've said, well, we look at history and what we look around now and we say, well, divine revelation, you know, what was good for people at the time when the book of Leviticus was written and they condemned homosexuality in certain ways wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for us now because we live in the 21st century and things are all different.
And that goes back to the heart of not just a paradigm shift, but also a break from reality. Because by virtue of that argument, what is effectively being pushed forth is the laws of nature need to be rejected or treated as changed.
Yeah, no, they will say, oh, no, we're just a natural law. It's just that natural, like nature, changes, right? And of course, the problem for them is like, well, nature changes, but evolution takes a pretty long time, you know. So nature hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 40 years. So it's like, oh, no. See, with human beings, it's their consciousness, it's their perceptions of reality which change, and we have to change with that, right? And that allows these elite people in universities who do cultural critique to then say, well, like, who determines what's, you know, part of the spirit of the age or the quote-unquote signs of the times? And the answer is, well, we do because we're the intellectuals in major universities, right? You can't expect the man in the pew to know what's going on culturally. We tell you.
Randall, I could go on and on with you, but thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you so much for having me on, always. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise, my guest has been Dr. Randall Smith of the University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas. We've been talking about his piece, The Abuse of Language and the Abuse of Power in the Church, and about how we can cling to magisterial truth. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.